What happens when Jasmine Crockett, a U.S. Congresswoman armed with truth, confronts Ibrahim Traoré, a military ruler accused of silencing 600 civilians, live before 193 world leaders at the UN? In a chamber built for diplomacy, she broke every rule and shattered every silence. With one photo and one name, she exposed a child the world was never meant to know. This isn't just a debate, it's a reckoning. And once you hear her final words, you'll understand why history may never forgive us. The ceiling of the United Nations General Assembly shimmered with gold leaf inlays, but no one looked up. Beneath the soaring dome and banners of 193 nations, the temperature in the hall was ice cold, not from the air, but from the anticipation. Delegates in tailored suits tapped their devices nervously. Interpreters hovered with headsets, waiting for the fire to ignite. Because everyone knew what was about to happen would not be diplomatic. It would be war, in words, but war nonetheless. At the center podium, lit by a halo of stage lights that made his epaulets glint like bayonets, stood Ibrahim Traoré. Dressed in full military uniform, the leader of Burkina Faso gripped the sides of the lectern as if anchoring himself to history. He didn't smile. He didn't blink. And when he spoke, his voice didn't rise. It struck. "Our continent bleeds while the West lectures," Traoré began, his French-accented English reverberating like the stomp of boots. "They talk of human rights as if we are children, but they never speak of the gold they steal, the uranium, the blood diamonds. They hold up democracy like a holy book and burn ours in the same fire." His finger jabbed at the air, accusing not a country but a system. Burkina Faso does not need moral lessons from those who built empires on our backs. The room held its breath. Some clapped. Others looked at their phones, pretending distraction. And then he said it, clear, cold, final. "Burkina Faso does not need a teacher of morality. We need justice." Silence. The kind of silence that didn't just linger. It throbbed. For a moment, the world stopped rotating inside that hall. Traoré's glare swept across the assembly like a floodlight. Somewhere in the second row, Jasmine Crockett exhaled slowly. She hadn't planned to speak. Her name wasn't on the official docket, but something in the room felt wrong. Deeply, dangerously wrong. It wasn't just the words. It was the applause that followed. Polite, scattered, but growing louder. Jasmine stood up. Her chair scraped against the marble floor like a gun cocking in a quiet room. Heads turned. The UN moderator blinked, then leaned forward. "Congresswoman Crockett, the floor is currently—" "I'm aware," Jasmine said, calm but firm. "But if justice is the subject, then I have something to say." A ripple moved through the chamber like static. Some delegates groaned, others whispered. A few, mostly from West African states, folded their arms in rigid disapproval. The moderator hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. The microphone shifted. The spotlight followed. And just like that, Jasmine Crockett, Democratic Congresswoman from Texas, walked to the podium with nothing in her hands but a silver pen. She didn't tap the mic. She didn't look at her notes because there weren't any. She placed the pen on the lectern like a sword laid down before battle, lifted her gaze, and began. "I did not come here to shame anyone," she said, "but I will not be shamed into silence either." Her voice was steady, southern-laced, and low, not a shout, but a promise. "Ibrahim Traoré says he wants justice. I ask, justice for whom?" The hall stiffened. Traoré's eyes narrowed. "For the people of Burkina Faso? The children sleeping in displaced tents because their villages burned while the army watched? Or is justice for the generals signing mining deals in the dark while their people die in daylight?" The tension cracked like a whip across the room. Jasmine didn't flinch. She leaned in, her tone sharper now, each word a hammer. "Power is not proven by how loudly you speak," she said, "but by how safely your people sleep." A pause, you could hear the air move. "And right now, millions are sleeping in fear." Her words were slow, surgical, unapologetic. Delegates looked at each other. Some whispered into their translators. One diplomat from Niger mouthed "Mon Dieu" under his breath. Traoré's jaw clenched. His military poise faltered just for a heartbeat. This wasn't a scripted counterpoint. This was insubordination, on an international stage. A woman, younger, unranked in the global pecking order, had just pierced the myth he had so carefully wrapped himself in. He started to rise, then stopped himself. Cameras were everywhere. Crockett had just made herself the lightning rod, and she wasn't done. "I know what colonialism looks like," Jasmine said, her voice cooling like steel. "I've seen it dressed in foreign aid, in trade agreements that benefit one side, and yes, in the arrogance of Western leaders who mistake charity for solidarity." She nodded briefly to her own delegation, some of whom shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "But let us not replace one oppressor with another who just happens to look like us." A tremor ran through the African bloc. Senegalese, Ghanaian, South African delegates turned to each other. Some nodded. Others stared straight ahead. A member of Traoré's entourage tapped furiously on his phone. Crockett continued slower now, as if lowering her voice to make them lean in. "I am a descendant of slaves. I know what it means to be silenced, erased, forgotten, but I also know what it means to resist." Her hand brushed the pen. "My father was beaten by police for trying to join a union. He taught me, speak truth, even if your voice shakes. And today, my voice does not shake." The room was still. No coughs, no fidgeting. The translators paused. Even the blinking lights of live broadcast cameras seemed to hold their rhythm. For one searing moment, all the diplomatic barriers cracked. This wasn't a politician versus a president. It was a survivor versus a soldier, a woman with memory versus a man with power. Traoré's face was granite. Behind his stillness, rage stirred. But he wouldn't explode. Not here. Not now. Instead, he leaned to his aide and whispered something. The aide typed swiftly. Messages were already being dispatched. Containment, rebuttal, retaliation. But none of that could erase the moment now burned into memory. Jasmine Crockett, standing alone, uninvited, unyielding, her words cutting deeper than any sanction. And the world had just turned to listen. The rain in Paris didn't fall. It whispered. Cold mist slid across the narrow sidewalks of Montparnasse like silk over stone, soft enough to mask footsteps, but sharp enough to sting the skin. Jasmine Crockett sat at a corner table inside Café de l'Espoir, its cracked windows fogged with condensation and age. The place wasn't chic, wasn't curated, it was forgotten. That was why it was perfect. The waitress barely glanced at her after delivering a black espresso. Jasmine didn't touch it. She was too focused on the man who had just entered, wearing a threadbare trench coat and sunglasses that didn't belong indoors. He moved like someone used to being followed, or hunted. His name was Arnaud Delacour, a name Jasmine suspected wasn't real. And he had once served France's DGSE, the External Intelligence Agency. Now he was freelance, which meant dangerous, expendable, and desperate. He slid into the seat across from her, without ceremony, glancing once at the window, then placing a small scuffed flash drive on the table between them. "That," he said in French accented English, "is why people die." Jasmine stared at the device like it was a loaded weapon. Maybe it was. "What's on it?" she asked. He didn't smile. "Gold. Blood. Lies." Then he leaned in and whispered, "And names you won't say out loud in a room with walls." She picked it up. It was warm. That unsettled her more than it should have. Arnaud leaned back and lit a cigarette, ignoring the no-smoking sign taped to the wall. "It's all mapped. Routes, handlers, bank codes, offshore companies. The gold starts in Burkina Faso, then Mali, then Dubai. Russia is the final ghost." Jasmine didn't blink. "Ghost?" He exhaled smoke like a curse. "Because once it gets there, it disappears. Laundered through Wagner-backed firms, converted into crypto, used to fund operations across the Sahel, and now propaganda. TikTok armies, deep fakes of dead artists singing love songs to Traoré. It's not just theft anymore. It's theater." She said nothing, just slipped the drive into the inside pocket of her coat. She paid in cash. Arnaud was gone before she stood. Outside, the rain still whispered, but Jasmine's heartbeat had begun to drum. She walked past shuttered bookstores and glowing metro signs, down into the catacombs of the Paris underground. Her phone was off. Her thoughts weren't. In the space of 1 hour, the lines between diplomacy and espionage had dissolved. She wasn't just a congresswoman anymore. She was holding evidence that could fracture alliances and upend governments. And worst of all, she believed it, every single word of it. Back in her hotel, Jasmine opened her laptop in a dim corner of the suite, the curtains drawn like a stage about to raise. She inserted the drive. A folder opened. Project Valet. Inside were flowcharts, arrows, code names, cargo logs, shipping routes through Ouagadougou and Timbuktu, plane manifests listing dual-use flights between Mali and Abu Dhabi. She saw flagged payments in Monegasque banks, cross-referenced names. One was a military attaché from Russia, another, shockingly, a consultant listed on a U.S. trade mission to Africa just last year. Her stomach dropped. It wasn't just Traoré, it was a web, and parts of it led straight to Washington. Jasmine stood abruptly. She crossed to the minibar, grabbed the first bottle of water, and drank like she'd been holding her breath for an hour. Her mind raced. If she went public, what would happen? Would she be discredited? Would she be labeled an enemy of African sovereignty? Worse, would she endanger those who were already vulnerable? But if she stayed silent, who would speak for the dead? Who would call out the gold that paid for silence while villages burned and children vanished into militias? She looked toward her suitcase. Inside, carefully wrapped in cloth, was an old photo of her father, taken on the picket line outside a steel mill in Dallas. His eyes tired, mouth pursed. 2 days later, he was hospitalized after being beaten by police. No charges were ever filed. No justice. Just silence. Jasmine remembered visiting him, only 10 years old, standing beside the hospital bed as he whispered through a broken jaw, "Speak, even if it hurts, especially when it hurts." She sat back down, slower this time. The flickering light from the screen cast her face in shadows and static. She opened a blank document and began typing. Not a speech, but questions. Questions for the UN, for the press, for the Department of State, for herself. Why was France withdrawing? Why was Russia advancing? Why were U.S. contractors linked to smelting operations in Dubai? Why was no one screaming? Somewhere outside her window, Paris glittered. Couples laughed in the rain. Music drifted from a bar down the alley. But inside that room, Jasmine's world had narrowed to one truth. She was holding a match above a powder keg, and once she dropped it, there would be no going back. She whispered it out loud, not for anyone else, but for herself. If they want silence, they pick the wrong woman. And with that, the investigation began. The sun hung low over the Dakar runway, casting long, molten shadows across the shimmering tarmac of Blaise Diagne International Airport. Heat rippled like water across the concrete, but beneath the golden sky, something colder was brewing. The airspace above Senegal's capital had been cleared for the arrival of dignitaries attending the emergency ECOWAS summit. Military police stood rigid along the private terminal, their sunglasses reflecting sleek motorcades and sweat-slicked agents murmuring into earpieces. Then, almost too perfectly, 2 aircraft arrived within minutes of each other, one bearing the tricolor of the United States, the other a matte gray jet adorned with the red, green, gold insignia of Burkina Faso. They were not meant to cross paths. But destiny doesn't ask for permission. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stepped down the aluminum stairs of her jet first, wearing a dark blue pantsuit that absorbed the sun and gave nothing away. Her heels clicked with precision, deliberate and rhythmic, as she approached the VIP corridor. Her aides followed at a respectful distance, their faces tense. From the opposite end of the tarmac, President Ibrahim Traoré emerged in a pressed military uniform without insignia, flanked by 4 guards dressed like shadows. His gait was casual, but there was a calculation in every step. The path between them was narrow, too narrow. On a tarmac that stretched for miles, the universe had funneled them into confrontation. Inside the glass-walled VIP entrance, their entourages collided. Literally. One of Traoré's aides brushed shoulders with Jasmine's assistant, causing files to scatter. For a split second, the space tensed like a coiled spring. Hands hovered near holsters. Security stiffened. Cameras turned. Reporters with press badges raised their phones instinctively. Jasmine crouched to pick up the fallen papers, her expression calm, but her eyes ice. As she rose, Traoré stood directly before her, blocking the corridor like a wall of iron. No hand was extended, no pleasantries exchanged, only a pause. Then he smiled without warmth. "So this is the face of American concern," he said, voice smooth as silk over barbed wire. "You arrive with speeches. We deal with corpses." His eyes scanned her, not with interest, but with measurement. "The West sends words. We face bullets." Around them, the press surged forward, their microphones held out like bayonets. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't break eye contact. Her tone was quiet, but every syllable hit with the weight of a gavel. "And your people," she said, "they face both, from within." A collective inhale rippled through the room. Even the air conditioning seemed to pause. Traoré's smile faltered, just for a second. But in that second, the cameras caught everything. Reporters whispered furiously into recorders. Photographers zoomed in. A journalist from Al Jazeera whispered, "This just made the front page." The Senegalese Minister of Protocol stepped forward awkwardly, trying to diffuse the tension with a gesture toward the waiting vehicles. But no one moved. It was as if the hallway had turned into a chessboard, and neither side would yield the square. "You speak as if you understand," Traoré said, voice lower now, darker. "As if standing behind microphones in Washington teaches you about the kind of war we face." He took one step closer. "We are hunted by terrorists, betrayed by neighbors, and starved by sanctions." He gestured vaguely toward the runway. "And still, we survive." Jasmine's reply was sharper than the Senegal sun. Survival is not leadership, and fear is not governance. She took a step of her own, matching his presence, her voice rising just enough to be caught by every lens. "Your people didn't elect you to survive, Mr. Traoré. They prayed for a future, and they got a regime." The word hit like a slap. Traoré's aide whispered something in his ear, but he brushed it off. His jaw flexed. His hands twitched at his sides, not from fear but from rage denied. Jasmine turned slightly, just enough to speak over her shoulder to her assistant. "Is the car ready?" Her tone made it clear. This wasn't a retreat. It was a dismissal. She began to walk past him, but paused just long enough to drop one last line without turning her head. "History doesn't care about uniforms. It remembers who bled and who blamed." And then she was gone. Outside, the motorcade rolled forward, its tinted windows reflecting both the setting sun and the firestorm left smoldering inside. News alerts had already begun pinging across phones worldwide. Crockett versus Traoré, airport showdown. Footage looped in slow motion, his clenched jaw, her cool stare, the 5 words that set the tone for everything to come. Behind closed doors, analysts would argue over the implications. Advisors would craft spin. Allies would choose sides. But in that moment, on that scorching strip of Senegalese concrete, one thing was undeniable. A Cold War had gone hot, and the world had just watched it ignite. The building was glass and chrome, a modernist box dropped into the foothills outside Palo Alto, surrounded by evergreens and security cameras that blinked like eyelids. Inside, the walls were white, the coffee organic, and the algorithms more dangerous than any bullet. Jasmine Crockett sat across from a young engineer with lime green hair and a sweatshirt that read, "Reality is rendered." His name was Felix, and he'd built deep fake detection tools used by 3 different intelligence agencies. But now he worked freelance because truth was no longer profitable, only weaponized. He opened his laptop and tapped a few keys. "You're going to want to see this," he said. Then the screen came alive with a TikTok clip showing R. Kelly, smiling, animated, singing a ballad about Ibrahim Traoré. Jasmine blinked. "He's in prison," she said. "Exactly," Felix replied, "and also dead in this version. Look at the eyes, too smooth. The skin texture's wrong. But the algorithm, flawless." The clip zoomed in on the fake R. Kelly crooning, "Ibrahim, son of Africa, breaker of chains," with CGI crowds cheering behind him. Then it cut to a montage of African children saluting a waving Traoré, the colors saturated like a Pepsi ad. Jasmine felt her stomach twist. "How many of these are out there?" she asked. Felix gave a humorless laugh. "Hundreds, maybe thousands. TikTok, Instagram, WhatsApp groups. And they're being seeded by bot farms in Moldova, Thailand, and a suspiciously well-funded media school in Ouagadougou. He clicked through a spreadsheet that made her breath catch. IP addresses, timestamps, metadata trails, clips of Trevor Noah endorsing Traoré, a fake speech from Angela Davis praising Burkina Faso's anti-imperial stand. Even an edited video of Jasmine herself, taken from a real UN panel, digitally manipulated to make her appear to nod approvingly as Traoré spoke. She recoiled. That never happened. Doesn't matter, Felix said. It's viral in Cameroon. #$ sister solidarity period. The phrase felt like poison on her skin. Her voice dropped. And no platforms taking this down? Felix shrugged. They label it satire. You know the drill. Freedom of expression until it's lethal. Jasmine's fingers dug into the armrest. Who's behind this? Felix didn't flinch. He typed a name, a Russian consultancy, then another, Black Forge, a PMC-linked influence advisory. Jasmine recognized one from the USB files in Paris. It confirmed everything. This wasn't just digital graffiti, it was psychological warfare. There's one more name you should know, Felix said, sliding a photo across the screen. Atiana Serge Oulon, Burkinabe journalist. 32, brilliant, obsessed with uncovering the AI network. Missing for 6 days, last seen in Bamako. Jasmine's voice dropped to a whisper. Dead? Felix shook his head. Unconfirmed, but her blog went dark. Her phone was found in a river. Her last post was a draft, never published. Jasmine stared at the screen. The headline on Atiana's last draft glared like a flare. The Messiah they manufactured. She felt a knot tighten in her chest. She tried to warn us, Felix nodded, and now you're the only one who can. For a moment, Jasmine was silent. Outside, California glowed like a mirage. Inside, her mind buzzed with static. She saw the headlines already forming. U.S. Congresswoman accuses African hero of propaganda. She'd be painted as the villain, a tool of the West, an enemy of Black resistance. But this wasn't about image, it was about manipulation. If a lie is told by someone who looks like your savior, does it still feel like a lie? 1 week later, in a packed congressional hearing room in Washington, Jasmine Crockett stood before a sea of cameras. The air was charged with anticipation. Her team had begged her to use a teleprompter. She refused. The future of truth, she began, is being edited in real time, not by governments, but by code. She laid out the deep fakes, the disinformation networks, the manipulation of Black identity for geopolitical gain. When she showed the fake R. Kelly video, gasps filled the room. When she showed the doctored clip of herself, the gasp turned into outrage. This isn't a foreign smear campaign, she said. It's a digital colonization, one click at a time. Reporters scrambled. Headlines exploded. As digital deception trended within minutes. Some called her brave, others called her reckless. Within hours, Burkina Faso's state media denounced her speech as an American attempt to destabilize African unity. Russian outlets mocked her as paranoid. Even some U.S. outlets questioned her motives. But Jasmine didn't flinch until the note arrived. It was slid under her office door in an unmarked envelope. No return address. Inside, one line typed in courier font. Find the right villain, not the wrong hero. No signature. No context. Just threat disguised as philosophy. Jasmine stared at it for a long time, then slowly folded it and locked it in her desk. She looked at the photo of her father again, his eyes weary but unbroken. She whispered, "They want me to shut up." But she wasn't going anywhere. The house didn't look like much. A crumbling stucco structure on the outskirts of Abidjan, hidden behind banana trees and rusting corrugated tin. But for the man inside, it was safer than any embassy. Jasmine Crockett sat in the dim light of a makeshift parlor, the fan above her creaking slowly, pushing hot air around the room like smoke from a fire, long extinguished. Across from her, in a wooden chair covered in old newspapers, sat a man who looked like he'd aged 5 years in 5 weeks. His name was Issouf Zongo, once a school teacher in the northern province of San Matenga, now a refugee in his own continent. His hands trembled as he poured water into chipped glasses. He didn't drink. He just stared at it, like it might disappear. He didn't speak at first, just handed her a stack of documents, handwritten maps, grainy photos, and a folded page with a red thumbprint. Jasmine flipped through them slowly, methodically. Each photo worse than the last. Shallow trenches, burned-out huts, limbs where faces should be. Barcelago, he finally said, his voice like sandpaper. 300 people, maybe more. Most never counted. Jasmine's heart began to pound. She had heard whispers, rumors of a massacre no one would own. But this was different. This was testimony. He leaned forward, eyes haunted. They told us it was for protection, that if we dug the trenches we could defend ourselves. They came with trucks, soldiers. They carried guns but no compassion. They picked men from each village. Farmers, teachers, even children. They gave us shovels. They gave us deadlines. His fingers clenched. 3 days. No food, no rest. Just dig. Jasmine could hear the scrape of metal on bone even in the silence. They said it was our duty to protect the motherland, he continued. But when the sky turned red, when the motorcycles came with men screaming Allahu Akbar and holding rifles, there were no soldiers, no government, no backup, just blood. He paused, his throat dry. The trenches became graves. Jasmine closed her eyes. The room spun. And the army? She asked. They retreated the night before. They left before the slaughter began. She sat in stunned silence, her knuckles white around the folder. Why? She whispered. Why didn't they fight? Zongo looked at her with a stare stripped of emotion. Because they never planned to. They wanted the world to see chaos and give them money. They needed death to justify power. Jasmine felt her breath hitch. She thought she'd heard the worst of Traoré's regime. But this was beyond corruption. This was calculated cruelty. She leaned in, her voice cracking slightly. Why are you still alive? Zongo blinked. Then slowly his jaw tightened. Because they caught me. But when they asked whose side I was on, I said none. His lips trembled. I told them I was a man who believed in books, not flags. That I taught children math, not politics. One of them laughed. The others beat me. Then they let me go, said I wasn't worth killing. Jasmine swallowed hard. And your family? The silence that followed was louder than any scream. Zongo looked away. My wife bled out in a ditch. My son, he was 12. They made him kneel. He stopped, unable to go on. Jasmine reached out, her hand trembling now, placing it over his. I'm so sorry, she whispered. But apologies were air, and air couldn't raise the dead. That night, Jasmine couldn't sleep. Back in her hotel room, she sat on the edge of the bed staring at the ceiling fan, its blades slicing through the dark like accusations. She replayed Zongo's words over and over. They needed death to justify power. Outside, the night was alive with city noise. Horns, dogs, distant music. But inside, she could hear only the sound of shovels against dry earth. She opened her laptop and stared at the folder marked Barcelago. It felt radioactive, but she knew what she had to do. Her phone buzzed, a message from her chief of staff in D.C. Please be careful. Traoré's team is monitoring every move. Jasmine replied with just one line. Then let them see me coming. She opened a new file. The title was simple. The Massacre They Buried. She began typing, fingers fast, tears unchecked. Zongo's voice echoed in her head with every keystroke. She wasn't just reporting, she was testifying for those who couldn't. And this time, the world would not look away. The lights on the Global Watch Live stage weren't warm, they were surgical. Bright white beams cut across the set like interrogators' lamps, reflecting off the polished circular desk where two figures sat under the judgment of cameras, history, and a room full of restless minds. The studio in London buzzed with energy as students, journalists, and international dignitaries filled the tiered auditorium, murmuring in anticipation. Phones were ready. Live streams rolled. Every seat was taken. Tonight was no ordinary debate. It was theater. It was trial. It was war in suits. Ibrahim Traoré sat on the left. No military garb tonight, just a tailored black suit, dark tie, and the posture of a man who knew the weight of power. His hands were clasped, his face composed, eyes scanning the crowd like a chess master reading a board already rigged. He didn't smile. He didn't blink. Opposite him sat Jasmine Crockett, draped in a deep purple ao dye that shimmered under the lights, a fusion of tradition and rebellion, justice and identity. Her hair was pinned up, her expression calm but coiled. The host, a sharp-jawed BBC veteran, welcomed the world, then turned to the guests. President Traoré, Congresswoman Crockett, the floor is yours. Traoré was first to speak. His voice was low and firm, the kind used to address troops or silence a room. I did not come here to defend myself, he said. I came here to defend the right of Africa to speak without permission. He paused, letting the applause ripple from the back rows. For too long, we have been spoken for, judged, measured against standards built in other lands. I did not seize power. I inherited a void, and I filled it, not with tyranny, but with resolve. He turned slightly, facing Jasmine. I saved my nation from silence. Jasmine waited, letting the moment breathe. Then she leaned forward slightly, voice as steady as a metronome. By silencing others? She asked. By blacking out the press? By disappearing journalists? By turning graveyards into policy? Her tone didn't rise. It cut. You say you saved a nation, but I've seen the evidence of the price your people paid. In Barcelona, in Kaya. In silence that isn't peace, it's fear. Gas murmured through the audience. Traoré didn't flinch. Instead, he pressed a small remote. Behind them, a screen descended. Footage played. Charred buildings, wailing children, smoke. This, he said, is Syria, bombed by American drones. Children incinerated in the name of democracy. Should we judge her for that? All heads turned to Jasmine. She looked at the screen, looked back at him. You're right, she said quietly. That happened, and I stood against it. I questioned it. I marched in the streets for it. She placed her hands flat on the table. But tonight, we're not here to talk about Syria. We're here to talk about Burkina Faso. And leadership isn't a comparison game. It's accountability. You can't justify murder with memory. The room went still. On Twitter, the clip was already being clipped, subtitled, retweeted. Some students nodded. Others frowned. A diplomat from Ghana checked his watch. Tension throbbed like electricity before a storm. Traoré smiled faintly now, but his eyes had darkened. It's easy, he said, to criticize from safety. From Washington, from studios like this. But I have watched children die in front of me. Not on YouTube, not on Fox News, in real time. I carry those screams in my dreams. Jasmine didn't blink. So do I, she said, but I don't carry them into lies. She reached into her folder and placed a photo face up on the desk. A dead child in Barcelona, a shallow trench, a bloodied toy clenched in a tiny hand. The image flickered on the screen behind them. The crowd gasped. This was your trench, she said. Your command, your absence. Her voice trembled just once, then steeled again. He wasn't a statistic. He had a name. Mamadou, 7 years old. Traoré's jaw tightened. He motioned to his aide. The photo vanished. This is emotional manipulation, he said. We are all grieving, but do not turn grief into propaganda. Jasmine turned to the audience now, not to him. Propaganda, she said, is what happens when only one story is allowed, when leaders erase the truth to protect their image. She gestured to the students watching. But you're smarter than that. You ask questions. You seek facts. The moderator began to close the session, thanking both guests for their candor. But a hand shot up in the third row. A young woman with glasses, barely 20, a Cambridge badge on her coat. The host hesitated, then nodded. You, quickly. She stood. Her voice shook, but it held. My question is for both of you, she said. You both speak with passion, with pain, but in a world drowning in lies, who among you is willing to be fact-checked? The room fell silent. The host froze. Traoré's mouth twitched. Jasmine sat back, folding her hands. "I welcome it," she said. Traoré said nothing, and that silence said everything. The rain clawed at the windows of Jasmine Crockett's office, like it had something to say. Outside, Washington was drenched in gray, a city built on marble, but powered by secrets. Inside, the air was too quiet. Jasmine stood at her window, arms folded, eyes fixed on the Capitol dome, half drowned in the storm. The phone on her desk buzzed twice, but she didn't turn. She already knew who it was, knew what it meant. When she finally answered, the voice on the other end was cool, professional, too polished to be kind. "Congresswoman Crockett," said the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, "it's time we spoke." She didn't sit. "Go ahead. There's concern from leadership, from state, from defense. Your comments on Traoré, the Barcelogo materials, the AI testimony, it's all escalating. We're receiving diplomatic pushback from half a dozen African nations." "I told the truth," she said. "And truth," he replied, "is not always useful in diplomacy." There was a pause, a long one. Then came the hammer. "If you don't pull back, you'll be removed from the committee." She blinked, then said evenly, "So be it." "Jasmine," he added softer now, "don't throw your whole career away for this." But the line was already dead. She walked to her desk, opened her laptop. There it was, an internal email, accidentally forwarded by a junior staffer. Subject line, "Crockett, escalating liability." The sender? A mid-level diplomat from the State Department. The body. She lacks strategic maturity. Reckless. Her performance on Global Watch alienated key actors. Recommend containment. Strip her from judiciary, reduce visibility. Let her burn out quietly. Jasmine closed the screen slowly. It felt like betrayal dressed in bureaucracy. She moved to the mirror on the wall. Not vanity, reflection. Her own eyes stared back. Tired, determined, lit with something no committee could legislate. "Have I gone too far?" she asked the glass. "Or have they not gone far enough?" The question hung unanswered. She reached into the drawer and pulled out a worn photograph. Her father. Standing outside a union hall in South Dallas, soaked in rain, fists clenched beside a sign that read, "Dignity isn't optional." Jasmine remembered that night, the way his coat dripped onto the kitchen floor, the way his voice cracked as he said, "I filed the complaint. Tomorrow they'll come for me." And they did. 2 days later, he was fired. No reason, just silence. She was 13, and she remembered how he looked at her then. Not angry, not afraid, just disappointed in the world. She stared at the photo now, her throat tightening. "Silence killed him," she whispered. "It's not going to kill me." Her phone vibrated again. This time a message. No name, no signature, just 5 words. "They're watching. Choose the stage." She exhaled slowly, heart pounding. This wasn't just political anymore. It was personal, systemic, violent. She looked around her office, bookshelves, plaques, framed awards from civil rights groups and universities. None of it could shield her now, but maybe they weren't supposed to. Maybe her job wasn't to be safe. Maybe it was to make noise. She sat at her desk and began drafting a new statement, one they wouldn't expect. Not for the press, not for the party, for the people. Outside, the storm thickened. But inside, Jasmine had never been clearer. They could strip her titles, but they would never strip her voice. And now, she would use it louder than ever. The road to the village was nothing more than a thread of cracked dirt carved through the hills of northern Togo, where the wind carried whispers and the trees bent like they had secrets to protect. Jasmine Crockett sat in the back of a rattling Jeep, its tires coughing red dust with every mile. They had been driving for hours, passing farms, rusted water pumps, and children who stared without smiling. Her guide, an independent Togolese journalist named Kosi, had said nothing since they left Lomé, except one thing. No security detail. You come alone, or the boy disappears. Jasmine had nodded. She knew what silence meant in these parts. It wasn't compliance. It was survival. They arrived near sunset. The village was little more than a cluster of huts with tin roofs and faded murals of forgotten elections. Kosi pointed toward a small blue shack at the edge of the fields. He's there. With his aunt Jasmine adjusted her scarf, stepped out of the jeep, and walked slowly across the cracked earth. Chickens scattered. A woman stirred porridge over a fire. Jasmine knocked gently on the door, her heart loud in her chest. When it creaked open, a boy stood there, 7 years old, barefoot, eyes too old for his face. His name was Ismail. She knelt to meet his gaze. "Hi," she said softly. "My name is Jasmine. I knew your mother." He didn't flinch. He just looked at her, then said, "Mama told me not to talk to Americans. But you don't sound like one on TV." Jasmine smiled, just barely. She was smart. He nodded, then stepped aside to let her in. The inside was bare, woven mats, a faded map of Africa taped to the wall, and a photograph of a woman with fierce eyes and a red scarf. Aissata. Jasmine recognized her instantly. Once a human rights firebrand in Burkina Faso, Aissata had gone missing in 2022 after leading protests against illegal gold mining operations backed by the military. Her disappearance had never been investigated. Jasmine sat with the boy while his aunt brought tea. Ismail didn't ask why she came. He just stared at her hands. "You have lawyer fingers," he said. "Mama said lawyers always look like they're holding back fire." Jasmine laughed, then swallowed it. "Your mother was brave," she said. "She stood up for people who couldn't speak." Ismail looked at the floor. They didn't like her speaking, then almost whispering, "She said if I ever saw my papa on television, I shouldn't believe him." Jasmine froze. "Did she tell you who your father was?" The boy shook his head. "Number. Just that he wore a uniform and smiled too much." Silence sat heavy in the room. Jasmine pulled a small tablet from her bag, opened it, and showed him a paused video. Traoré at the UN, chin lifted, voice raised. "Is this him?" Ismail stared, then nodded. "Yes, that's the man Mama said not to trust." The words hit like thunder in her chest. She closed the tablet gently. This wasn't just scandal. This was legacy. A child hidden from the world not because he was a shame, but because he was a threat. When Jasmine left the hut, the sun was already gone. Shadows stretched like knives across the ground. Kasi stood waiting beside the jeep, arms crossed. "You got what you came for?" he asked. She didn't answer, but the look in her eyes said everything. On the drive back, her phone buzzed. No name, no number. Just a message. "If you publish what you found, you won't make it to Monday." She showed it to Kasi. He didn't look surprised. "They're watching, always, even here." By the time they reached the city, Jasmine had already sent an encrypted copy of her notes to 3 trusted allies across the globe. She wasn't naive. She knew this changed the stakes. Traoré wasn't just a dictator. He was a man who erased a woman and buried a child to protect a myth. And now that myth had a face, a name, a voice. That night, Jasmine stayed in a hotel room with no windows. She sat with her back against the door, gun beside her, laptop open. She watched the boy's face over and over in her mind, his quiet strength, the way he looked at power without fear. And she thought of her father, of his fists clenched in the rain, of the words he once told her. "There are truths so dangerous, they don't want them spoken. That's why you speak them louder." Jasmine opened a new file. Title, "The Child They Tried to Erase," and she began to write. The chamber of the United Nations Human Rights Council felt colder than usual. Too vast, too quiet, like a cathedral on the eve of judgment. Above the delegates, the familiar mural of doves and olive branches seemed almost ironic today. Cameras lined the walls. Interpreters whispered into earpieces in 7 languages. Flags barely stirred in the recycled air. This was not a ceremony. It was a trial without a gavel. At the center of it all stood a single podium. And behind that podium, waiting, motionless, hand clenched around a folder marked Barcelago Massacre, was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. She didn't wear armor, but she carried weight. Her purple suit was darker than usual. Her voice was not yet heard, but her presence was already thunder. As the delegate from Senegal finished his prepared remarks, cautious, diplomatic, non-committal, Jasmine rose from her seat. The room shifted. Phones came up. Heads turned. The moderator looked uncertain, then nodded. "You may proceed, Congresswoman." She stepped forward, heels clicking softly on the polished stone floor, each footfall a countdown. In her left hand was a photo of Isata. In her right, a single sheet of paper she never intended to read. She didn't open with greetings. She didn't cite articles or preambles. She began with a name. Her name was Isata. The room went still. She was a mother, a teacher, a human rights activist. She disappeared in 2022 after leading protests against illegal mining in Burkina Faso. Jasmine held up the photo. "This is her, and this," she opened her folder and lifted a second image, "is what was left behind." It was a photo of a boy, 7 years old, sitting on a straw mat in northern Togo, his eyes hollow, his face tight with inherited silence. His name is Ismail. He doesn't know his father, only the warning his mother left him. "If you see your father on TV, don't believe him." A sharp breath escaped from somewhere near the Angola delegation. Jasmine didn't blink. "I'm not here to make political speeches," she said. "I'm here to tell you what I've seen. I sat with a man who watched his wife bleed out and his son executed for refusing to hold a rifle. I've seen footage of children digging trenches they would later be buried in, not by terrorists, but by their own government." Her voice didn't rise, it deepened, hardened. Barcelago was not a tragedy, it was a decision. A wave of discomfort moved through the room. Some delegates looked down, others whispered, but Jasmine's voice never wavered. "I don't bring you charts, I bring you stories, because numbers numb, but names, they burn. Mamadou, Issouf, Isata, these are not collateral, they are consequences of cowardice, of complicity, of silence." She placed the photos on the lectern with deliberate care, as if laying offerings at an altar. "I have been told, repeatedly, that I'm risking too much, that I'm destabilizing alliances, that I don't understand geopolitics." She looked up. Her eyes cut through the room like floodlights. "But I understand this. When children are turned into shields, when journalists vanish, when mothers are erased, diplomacy becomes a disguise for death." Gasps, murmurs. The Russian delegate shook his head and scribbled something. The Burkinabe representative sat frozen, expression unreadable. Jasmine took a breath, slower now, heavier. "I was raised by a man who lost everything after speaking out against injustice. He was beaten, fired, forgotten, but he never lied. And he taught me that silence isn't peace, it's permission." She let the words sink, then added almost whispering, "And history will not forgive our permission today." The final sentence detonated like a depth charge beneath the chamber's silence. There was a beat, one long breath where no one moved. Then a single pair of hands clapped, then another, then another. The applause began slowly, tentatively, but within seconds it surged, full, relentless. A storm breaking against centuries of caution. Some delegates stood, others looked at each other, uncertain, then joined. The moderator banged her gavel once, then again, but the clapping didn't stop. Finally, when calm returned, she cleared her throat. "We will now proceed to the vote." The screen behind her lit up with country names. Each delegate cast their decision. Green, green, yellow, red, green. The colors bled across the screen like tides shifting in real time. Resolution 193-A. To initiate sanctions and humanitarian oversight on Burkina Faso for verified human rights violations. Passed. Jasmine exhaled, not in relief, but in recognition. This wasn't the end, but it was the first crack in the wall, and she had swung the hammer. The runway in Ouagadougou glistened beneath the dry heat as Ibrahim Traoré stepped off his jet with the poise of a man who refused to believe he'd lost anything. Around him, soldiers saluted stiffly, press cameras clicked in orchestrated rhythm, and state media live-streamed his return like the homecoming of a war hero. Inside the capital, new laws were already drafted. Restrictions on foreign journalists, the shutdown of community radio stations, and digital surveillance mandates passed under the guise of national security. Overnight, the Ministry of Truth became a building with real walls. The flag of the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, no longer flew beside Burkina Faso's emblem. Mali and Niger had withdrawn quietly, the coalition fractured under the weight of scandal and silence. But none of it was mentioned in Traoré's televised address. "We stand strong," he declared. "We will not kneel to outside noise." That same evening, across an ocean and political galaxy, Jasmine Crockett sat under the muted lights of a news studio in Atlanta. She wore no brooch, no flag, no party pin, just a plain black dress and a steady gaze. The host across from her smiled with practiced polish, flipping through her notes as cameras blinked red. "You lost your judiciary seat," she said, voice smooth. "You've been labeled divisive by your own party, censured by foreign embassies. Do you think you lost?" Jasmine didn't blink. She leaned forward, hands clasped, eyes sharp but not bitter. "I didn't win," she said quietly, "but I dared to lose with meaning." The silence that followed was louder than any applause. The clip went viral before the segment ended. Tens of thousands reposted the quote with their own stories. Activists, teachers, survivors of regimes both distant and domestic. But Jasmine stayed out of the spotlight for weeks. No interviews, no podiums, just long hours at home, sorting through case files, working on policy drafts no one promised to read. It wasn't until the call came from the African Union that she stepped back into the light. They didn't ask for a politician. They asked for a voice, an advisor on human rights reform across the continent. It was symbolic, yes, but it was also power, a different kind. Back in Burkina Faso, propaganda billboards went up. Traoré's face painted 10 feet tall beside slogans that read, "Order through loyalty," and "Sovereignty has no witnesses." Military presence increased in rural zones. Textbooks were rewritten. Citizens were required to register social media accounts with ID numbers. The truth was no longer something to fear, it was something to erase. And yet whispers still traveled. About a boy in Togo, about a mother who vanished, about a speech at the UN that made soldiers pause their rifles for half a second longer. In Geneva, Jasmine stood before the AU Council in a modest gray blazer, reading out recommendations for regional press freedom standards. Her tone was calm, but her words were laced with quiet steel. "You don't need tanks to occupy a nation," she said. "You only need to teach its children that fear is normal." Delegates leaned forward. A few smiled. Even more didn't. That was how she knew it was working. Weeks later, a message arrived in her inbox. No sender, no subject, just a video link. She clicked. It was grainy footage, filmed in secret, shaky, a classroom, rural, dusty walls, a teacher holding up a picture of Mamadou, the boy who died in Barcelona. "What do we do when we forget names?" the teacher asked. A child raised her hand. "We say them louder." Jasmine stared at the screen, tears catching in the corners of her eyes. "Damn right," she whispered. Legacy, she realized, was not a statue. It was a spark. The next time she spoke publicly, it wasn't on a government stage. It was on a campus lawn in Baltimore, standing before a crowd of students who had turned her quote into a banner. "To lose with meaning is to win where it counts." She didn't give a lecture. She told stories. About a father in the rain, about a teacher in hiding, about a child who didn't know his father but knew how to tell the truth. She ended with one line, spoken slowly, like a promise. "The work is not to be right. The work is to stay loud." And across the world, people listened. The applause faded. The camera lights dimmed. And the world, as it always does, moved on. But something remained. Not just in Jasmine Crockett's eyes, or the trembling of her hands after each speech, or even in the flickering screens of newsrooms from Lagos to DC. It remained in the air. The kind of weight you don't shake off with policy or forget with headlines. A reckoning had passed. But the cost? That stayed. The cost was never in the victory. It was in the moments after, when no one is watching, and you're left with the silence of choices that can't be undone. For Jasmine, that silence wasn't empty. It was sacred, because within it lived the question that haunted every act of courage. Was it worth it? Let's be honest. Jasmine Crockett didn't just go up against a regime. She went up against an entire system that rewards silence and punishes memory. From Capitol Hill to the Sahel, she faced walls that smiled at her in public and schemed behind closed doors. They called her divisive, reckless, too loud, too emotional. But beneath their civility was a fear they couldn't admit. She was naming what they refused to see. She was dragging ghosts into daylight. When she exposed the digital propaganda network, she wasn't just dismantling AI bots. She was stripping power from narratives built to manipulate identity. When she named the massacre of Barcelona, she wasn't pointing fingers. She was holding up mirrors. And when she found the hidden child, she didn't weaponize the secret. She gave it voice. The lesson? Truth is not always gentle. Sometimes it breaks things, and sometimes it should. But the world doesn't reward people who break things for the right reasons. Jasmine lost her committee seat. She lost the confidence of her party. She lost the backing of donors who preferred photo ops over actual justice. Yet through every betrayal, every whispered threat, every empty corridor she walked alone, she never lost herself. That's the human heart of the story, the courage to be disliked, the bravery it takes to say, I'd rather be abandoned with my integrity than applauded with my silence. There is a quiet violence in watching people negotiate with injustice for comfort's sake. Jasmine refused that deal, and in doing so she reminded us that legacy isn't made in moments of triumph. It's shaped in the aftermath, when the cameras are off and the phone doesn't ring, and you still choose to speak. What Jasmine faced wasn't just political, it was personal, and that's what makes her stand so rare. Because the most terrifying opponent is not the dictator in a uniform. It's the familiar face in your own government who leans close and whispers, not now. Jasmine faced that and still stepped forward. She stared down global complicity, international gaslighting, and the cold machinery of diplomacy that treats human rights as chess pieces. And through all that, she didn't harden. She held on to the one thing that institutions can't steal: empathy. She didn't become what she fought. That is where many fall. That is where she rose. We often imagine heroes as statues, unshakable and flawless. But the truth is, they bleed. They second guess. They cry alone. The night Jasmine whispered, "Silence killed him." It won't kill me. She wasn't being defiant. She was being honest. That's what makes her story so unbearable and so necessary. She carried the weight of generations on her shoulders and still walked into rooms built to crush her. She didn't ask to lead. She responded to absence. In a world too comfortable with erasure, she became memory, living, breathing, defiant memory. And yet she paid. That's the part we rarely tell. That the cost of truth-telling isn't abstract. It's brutal. You lose funding. You lose friends. You lose sleep. But if you endure, if you persist, you gain something that no title can match: moral clarity. Jasmine now walks without a committee badge, but with the eyes of a continent watching. She no longer speaks from a podium in Congress, but from the pages of whispered stories in classrooms where children, like Mamadou and Ismail, learn that justice has a face. That is victory, quiet, enduring, unshakable. So what does this teach us? That courage is not a performance, it's a discipline. And the truth doesn't need to be convenient to matter. The story of Jasmine Crockett reminds us that justice isn't a destination. It's a choice, over and over, again. It's choosing to tell the story of the dead, even when the living beg you not to. It's looking power in the eye and saying, you may outrank me, but you will not outlast me. It's standing in a storm with nothing but your name and saying, that's enough. And for those of us watching, unsure of our own courage, wondering when or how or if we should act, the lesson is simple. You don't need to have it all figured out. You don't need perfect words. You just need to be willing to lose something for what's right. You need to be willing to carry someone else's silence on your shoulders until they find the strength to speak. That's how the world changes, not with declarations, but with decisions. Of course, stories like these carry weight. The characters may be dramatized, the events condensed. But every injustice referenced here echoes with real-world roots. The consequences are not fiction. The truths are not imagined. They belong to people who cannot afford the luxury of forgetting. And so we honor them not by idealizing their pain, but by continuing their fight with attention, with action, with vigilance. Because silence may feel like safety, but history has never been kind to those who kept quiet when it mattered most. And Jasmine Crockett, she refused to be kind to history's silence. And if this story shook you, even just a little, then let that feeling sit with you. Let it do something. Because Jasmine Crockett didn't endure all this, so we could simply nod and scroll away. She didn't walk through halls built to silence her just so we could applaud and move on. She risked everything to force a conversation most people would rather avoid. She lost her seat, her protection, her political comfort, not because she was wrong, but because she was right too soon, too boldly, too unapologetically. And if that doesn't make us act, if that doesn't light a fire under our own complacency, then what are we even doing? So now it's your turn. Your voice, your platform, no matter how big or small, it matters. Share this story. Comment your thoughts. Tell us what made you angry, what made you weep, what made you believe again. Subscribe not just to stay informed, but to stay connected to a truth that keeps breathing even when the world tries to bury it. And hit that bell, because the next voice we amplify might be the one no one else dares to. And if you've been silent for too long, let this be the moment you speak. Because the worst kind of silence is the one that knows better and says nothing. We are not here to entertain you. We are here to wake you, to call you forward, to remind you that stories like Jasmine's are not fiction. They are warnings and hope and fuel. If you believe voices like hers should not be forgotten, then lift her name, carry her fight, and join us in refusing to let silence win. This is more than content. This is memory in motion. Now press play on change. Thank you for staying till the end. Your time, your heart, your presence matters more than you know. If this story spoke to you, speak back. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Let's keep this conversation and this fight alive.